Beneath the marble perfection of ancient Greece, beneath the statues of Stoic philosophers and noble warriors that modern history books love to celebrate, there existed another world, one whispered about in shadows and spoken of only in the language of ecstasy, secrecy, and scandal. It was a world where love was not merely an emotion but a force of divinity. Desire could be ritual. Pleasure could be worship. And to give oneself over to passion was, for some Greeks, the closest one could get to touching the divine. They did not ask whether such acts were moral. They asked whether the gods were watching, and whether those gods approved. And many believed they did. To an outsider standing at the gates of one of these sacred gatherings, perhaps a moonlit hillside temple dedicated to Aphrodite, or an underground grotto echoing with drums and flutes in honor of Dionysus, the scene might have looked more like chaos than devotion. Men and women veiled in garlands, their bodies glistening with oil, moving in trance-like rhythm, chanting the names of their gods as if trying to summon them down from Olympus. Some came seeking blessing. Some came seeking transformation. Some came simply because they wanted to feel something more powerful than ordinary life could offer. They believed that to love wildly, uncontrollably, without shame, was not corruption, it was transcendence. But for every worshipper who felt the touch of the divine in those moments, there were others, standing outside, who saw only depravity. Even in Greece itself, not all agreed on how far love and ritual should intertwine. Philosophers argued, lawmakers debated, and ordinary citizens whispered. Were these cults keepers of mystical truth, or were they dangerous, dissolving the boundaries that kept society intact? Yet their influence only grew. Women found power in places where normal society silenced them. Men formed sacred bonds that ran deeper than blood. Priests wore perfume instead of armor. Warriors danced instead of drilled. And slowly, the lines between love, religion, and rebellion began to blur. For centuries, the Greeks lived in that strange space between reverence and risk. To them, beauty and madness were siblings. Pleasure and wisdom were not enemies. A man could spend his morning debating ethics in the agora and his night drinking wine in a grove, whispering prayers to a god of frenzy, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. The same city that built the Parthenon, the symbol of logic and balance, also hosted midnight festivals where revelers howled beneath the full moon, believing the veil between mortal and divine had finally thinned. They were not ashamed of this paradox. They celebrated it. They believed that to be truly human was to contain both order and chaos, Apollo and Dionysus, restraint and surrender. But history does not belong to those who feel the most. It belongs to those who write. And centuries later, new rulers would rise, men in robes instead of armor, carrying crosses instead of swords, and they would look upon these old Greek rites with horror. To them, what the Greeks had called sacred love was nothing but blasphemy disguised as worship. What the Greeks saw as divine ecstasy, the Church named demonic temptation. And so began one of the greatest acts of cultural erasure in history. Temples were destroyed. Scrolls were burned. Priests and priestesses vanished. The whispers of these forbidden love cults were forced into silence. Yet silence does not erase memory. It buries it. And beneath the ruins of old theaters and crumbling sanctuaries, beneath mosaics and votive offerings sealed beneath dust, traces remain. Fragments of hymns carved into stone. Statues of gods touching gods in tenderness. Graffiti of lovers promising eternal devotion in the name of divine passion. The Church may have declared these cults obscene, but they could not extinguish the truth that for centuries, love, in all its forms, was not a sin in Greece. It was a path to enlightenment. So the question remains, were these cults shameless orgies masquerading as faith? Or were they guardians of a forgotten philosophy, one that taught that the body and soul were not rivals but allies? To stand in judgment is easy for the modern mind. To understand, that is far more difficult. Because to truly understand them, we must enter their world, not as critics, but as witnesses. We must try, for a moment, to see love as they did, not fragile, not hidden, not bound by law, but roaring like fire, divine and unstoppable. Only then can we decide whether history lied about them, or whether they were telling a truth the world was never ready to hear. If one wishes to understand why these love cults existed at all, one must first abandon the modern idea that religion is primarily about obedience. In the ancient Greek worldview, the gods were not distant moral judges, they were participants in existence. They felt hunger, rage, jealousy, joy. They fell in love recklessly, betrayed one another constantly, shape-shifted into animals to seduce mortals, and even suffered heartbreak. Their mythology was not written to frighten people into submission, it was written to justify why human beings felt so much. If the gods themselves were driven by longing, how could longing be a sin? The Greeks did not separate flesh from spirit. They believed that beauty was a reflection of divine order, that desire was not a weakness but a signal of cosmic alignment. To gaze upon someone and feel the sudden rush of attraction was not shameful, it was a moment of divine recognition. In this worldview, devotion was not proven through denial. It was proved through surrender. And so, alongside temples of traditional worship, built for ceremony, sacrifice, and state-approved ritual, there existed another layer of spiritual life, one not recorded in public decree but whispered from lover to lover, from initiate to initiate. These love cults did not arise suddenly. They grew slowly, like ivy over marble. Some began with poetry. Traveling bards would sing of Eros not as a mischievous boy with wings but as the original god, older than creation itself, the force that drew chaos into harmony, the attraction that pulled existence together. Others found root in festivals. The worship of Aphrodite, goddess of love, was not a passive affair. Her celebrations were loud, fragrant, drenched in saffron and honeyed wine. Women let down their hair, men laid aside their weapons, and for one night they were not defined by status but by passion. But it was in the cult of Dionysus where the division between the ordinary and the ecstatic truly dissolved. To the uninitiated, his rites looked like madness, processions of intoxicated revelers wandering mountains and forests, singing until their voices broke, dancing until their feet bled. Yet beneath the frenzy was a philosophy older than reason itself. Only by losing oneself could one glimpse the truth. Only by stepping outside the boundaries of identity could the soul remember what it once was: infinite, divine, unrestrained. Those who saw only drunkenness misunderstood entirely. The wine was not the purpose. It was the doorway. There were other cults, quieter but no less transformative. In Corinth, the temple of Aphrodite was tended by priestesses who, according to later Roman and Christian accounts, offered sacred intimacy to worshippers, not as mere transaction, but as ritual cleansing, a moment where guilt and sorrow were washed away in touch. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by hostile writers is still debated today. But what is undeniable is that across Greece, from city to island, sexuality and sanctity blurred in ways that later civilizations would refuse to tolerate. Even among warriors, love became ritual. The sacred band of Thebes, 150 pairs of male lovers bound not by blood but by passion, believed that a man would fight more fiercely for the one who lay beside him in battle. To them, love was not softness. It was armor. It was oath. While philosophers debated ethics in marble halls, these soldiers carved their philosophy in iron and shield. Their bond was not merely tolerated, it was celebrated as the pinnacle of loyalty. Modern minds, trained to see history in neat compartments, politics separate from spirituality, romance separate from law, struggle to comprehend how seamlessly it all merged in Greece. A priest could also be a lover. A warrior could be both protector and beloved. A festival could be both sacred rite and fevered celebration. They did not apologize for this fusion. They feared purity more than passion. In their view, anything that isolated the mind from the body was dangerous. Anything that fractured a person into halves was an insult to the gods who had created humanity in wholeness. Yet beneath this openness lay a tension. Not everyone was comfortable with unrestrained devotion. Certain lawmakers believed that passion, left unchecked, could erode discipline. Some philosophers warned that constant indulgence led to spiritual emptiness rather than enlightenment. And so across the centuries, Greece developed one of history's most fascinating contradictions. A society that both worshipped love and tried to regulate it. That is where the cults found their true power. They existed in the spaces where law could not reach, in private gardens, in secret gatherings, in moonlit caves beyond the city walls. You did not join one because you wished to break rules. You joined because the rules could not contain what lived inside you. Some were driven by heartbreak, others by awakening. Some came to forget their names, others came to discover them. It is easy to imagine them as libertines, as reckless hedonists seeking only thrill. But that is the lie history tells when it wishes to simplify what it cannot control. These cults did not preach chaos. They preached transformation. They taught that love was not simply pleasure, it was metamorphosis. To touch another was to touch eternity. To love without fear was to stand in defiance of death itself. And perhaps that is why, when a new faith rose, one that demanded purity over passion, obedience over ecstasy, these cults would become targets. Not because they were obscene, but because they were powerful. Because they offered humanity something the church could never allow, the belief that salvation could be found not in restraint, but in embrace. They called him the liberator. Not because he conquered cities or freed slaves, but because he shattered the chains no iron could bind, the chains wrapped around the human heart. Dionysus was unlike any other god in the Greek pantheon. Zeus ruled with thunder, Athena with wisdom, Apollo with reason, but Dionysus ruled with surrender. He did not demand offerings of grain or gold. He demanded something far more dangerous, control. To join his cult, one did not kneel. One danced. Initiates were not branded with symbols. They were marked by ecstasy. There were no sermons, no sacred texts, no list of commandments carved into stone. His faith was not memorized. It was felt. When the drums began, deep, primal, relentless, something ancient stirred inside the human body. A rhythm older than language, older than civilization itself. It was not music. It was a memory. The rites were held at night, far from the eyes of those who would judge. Some gathered in forests illuminated only by torches, their flames licking the darkness like tongues of the god himself. Others met in underground chambers where sound echoed like distant thunder. They wore garlands of ivy and fawnskin cloaks, symbolizing the shedding of identity. Each person left behind their name, their status, their reputation. In that moment, the slave and the aristocrat were equal. A queen could stand beside a beggar and neither would know who the other had been. Dionysus demanded anonymity, not for secrecy, but for rebirth. The women, known as maenads, were said to fall into trances so deep that they could run for miles barefoot over thorns and jagged rock without feeling pain. Later writers, hostile to the cult, claimed that in their frenzy, they tore animals apart with their bare hands, devouring raw flesh as an act of sacred communion. Whether this was truth or slander remains unknown. But to the Greeks, even the rumor held power. It meant that within every human being, beneath the polished surface of civility, there existed a wildness that no law could tame. And then came the moment that defined the ritual, when strangers, now bound by shared frenzy, reached out for one another. Some embraced in laughter, others in tears. Some collapsed in exhaustion, their bodies trembling as if struck by lightning. Some found comfort in touch, in lips pressed against lips, in arms wrapped around waists. The passion was not always sensual, but when it was not seen as shameful. For in that sacred space, the human body was not temptation. It was instrument. It was altar. To love another was to honor the god. There were stories of men who entered these rites broken and emerged healed. Of women who came silenced by society and left roaring with power. Of marriages saved, of grief transformed, of bitterness released like smoke into the sky. The cult did not promise miracles. It promised catharsis, the cleansing that comes not from obedience, but from emotional eruption. They believed that to suppress desire was to invite madness. To unleash it in worship was to attain clarity. But such freedom terrified those who valued order. City leaders feared that gatherings without hierarchy could become riots. Philosophers feared that surrender of reason could erode virtue. And when Rome rose to power, absorbing Greece into its empire, the suspicion grew deadly. To Roman eyes, the rites of Dionysus, now called Bacchus, were not sacred celebrations. They were threats. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued a decree against the Bacchanalia, condemning them as dens of seduction, conspiracy, and assassination. They portrayed the cult as a network of traitors hiding treason beneath the veil of passion. Temples were raided. Priests were arrested. Worshippers were tortured until they named their lovers, their leaders, their gods. Some were executed in public. Others disappeared into dungeons, never seen again. But repression could not extinguish what had taken root in the human soul. Even as Rome outlawed the rites, they continued underground. Even as the church later declared Dionysus a demon, a corrupter of innocence, his spirit refused to die. It lived in theater, in poetry, in festivals that pretended to be respectable but still pulsed with unruly joy. It lived in every moment when passion overthrew caution. In every secret touch shared between forbidden lovers. In every voice that rose in song louder than reason could silence. For the cult of Dionysus taught something too profound to erase, that love cannot be governed, that ecstasy cannot be legislated, that the deepest truths of the human spirit are not found in stillness, but in the trembling breath between restraint and surrender. And if this was the world the church sought to conquer, one must ask, how could a doctrine of purity ever hope to defeat a God who taught that desire itself was holy? If Dionysus represented love as chaos and liberation, Aphrodite represented love as strategy, as beauty wielded like a weapon, as grace sharpened into influence. She was not worshipped only in temples, but in mirrors, in perfume, in the lingering glance exchanged across a crowded banquet. And unlike the gods of war or state, she chose no single class of follower. She belonged equally to queens and to courtesans. To her, the beggar draped in silk was no different from the noble wrapped in rags. Beauty was not measured by status. It was measured by effect, by how deeply one could bend the will of another. In the city of Corinth, her temple glittered high upon the Acrocorinth, overlooking the sea. Ancient writers claimed that hundreds of priestesses lived there, not cloistered in silence, but descending into the city each night, veiled in fine cloth and golden bracelets, offering what the church would later call sin, but what the Greeks called divine hospitality. Were they prostitutes? Or were they healers? The answer depends on who tells the story. To a visiting merchant far from home, they were salvation. To a philosopher seeking purity, they were temptation. But to their worshippers, they were bridges, human vessels through which Aphrodite herself touched the world. These women, known as Hetaira, were unlike ordinary wives. They were not confined to weaving rooms or judged solely by their obedience. They were educated, eloquent, politically shrewd. They dined beside men at symposiums, debated rhetoric with generals, advised kings in moments of crisis. They understood desire not as mere pleasure, but as leverage. They wielded affection like statesmen wielded treaties, sealing alliances in silk rather than ink. They could ruin reputations with a whisper, or save lives with a smile. And yet the church, centuries later, would remember them only as harlots. But Aphrodite did not limit her blessing to women. There were men, too, who bent their bodies into prayer, not before altars of stone, but upon the laps of lovers. In Cyprus and Paphos, priests known as kinnaras served the goddess not through chastity, but through adornment. They wore makeup, jewelry, soft robes scented with myrrh. They sang hymns in voices neither wholly male nor wholly female. Some offered themselves physically to worshippers as part of ritual cleansing. Some lived their entire lives as embodiments of divine androgyny, walking proof that love had no fixed form. Later historians, most of them Christian or Roman moralists, recoiled in horror at such fluidity. They accused these priests of perversion, of corrupting the natural order. But while those critics wrote in ink, the practitioners wrote in memory, in the lives they touched, in the ceremonies they performed beneath moonlight where judgment could not reach. For in the ancient Greek mind, transformation was not deviance. It was sacred. If Aphrodite herself had been born from sea foam, rising naked from chaos into perfection, why should her followers not also be reborn? And so the cults of love diversified. In some cities, processions of married women would march through the streets carrying images of the goddess, asking her to bless their husbands with loyalty or punish them if they strayed. In others, unmarried girls prayed not for good husbands but for good lovers. Not every prayer was spoken with innocence. Many were whispered with hunger. Aphrodite was not merely patron of brides. She was patron of desire itself, polite or forbidden. But by far the most misunderstood ritual of her worship was the offering of the body. To the Greeks, the act of physical union was not inherently dirty. Could be cheapened, yes, abused, exploited, misused. But when conducted with reverence, with consent, with intention, it could be sacrament. The exchange of touch became an exchange of energy. A kiss could be a hymn. A night in warm arms could be a pilgrimage. And yet, surrounding all of this beauty was a growing shadow. Rome was rising, and with Rome came a new hunger for control. Unlike the Greeks, who tolerated contradiction, the Romans craved order. They believed every citizen should know their place, every marriage should serve the state, every desire should be restrained by discipline. Under their rule, the worship of Aphrodite became tolerated only when it remained decorous. No wild festivals, no unregulated priestesses, no public displays of ecstasy. Her temples became quieter. Her priestesses became fewer. Her worship faded indoors, behind curtains, in whispered breath. But the greatest threat was yet to come, not from soldiers, but from Scripture. A faith was spreading across the empire, one that declared the flesh corrupt, desire dangerous, and purity the highest virtue. A faith that saw Aphrodite not as goddess, but as devil. And when that faith took power, every ritual of love became rebranded as sin. The first Christians did not come to Greece with armies. They came with words. And sometimes words can conquer more thoroughly than swords. They walked through streets once filled with garlands and flutes and saw not beauty, but danger. Where Greeks saw devotion in a lover's embrace, the Christians saw bondage. Where Greeks saw transformation in ecstatic ritual, they saw possession. And where Greeks saw Aphrodite smiling upon her worshippers, they saw demons wearing her face. At first, they spoke quietly. They were few in number, often mocked for their insistence that flesh was a temporary burden, that pleasure was a test, that the body was not to be celebrated but endured. To the Greeks, who believed that the gods themselves laughed, loved, danced, and bled, this new doctrine sounded like a philosophy for ghosts. What good was a life without ecstasy? What virtue was there in denying joy simply for the sake of discipline? To refuse wine, music, and touch, was that holiness or was it fear? But slowly things began to change. It was not the strong who first embraced the new faith. It was the broken, the ones who had been cast out by the very cults that preached liberation. Former priests who felt abandoned by fading gods. Courtesans no longer desired. Widows left with nothing but aching memory. They listened to Christian promises of redemption and found comfort in renunciation. If love had failed them, perhaps holiness would not. The Church offered something the love cults could not: permanence. A promise that suffering would be rewarded, that restraint would be honored, that every tear would be repaid with eternal life. In comparison, the pleasures of Aphrodite and Dionysus suddenly seemed fleeting, like mist evaporating beneath morning sun. The body aged. Beauty faded. Desire changed its target without warning. But heaven, they said, did not waver. It could not be seduced or betrayed. It was secure. And so began the slow rewriting of morality. Where once the Greeks taught their children that to love beautifully was to live wisely, the Christians taught theirs that to avoid temptation was to live righteously. Where once sacred courtesans were honored with garlands, they were now whispered about with shame. Where once a priest who walked in silk and perfume was praised for embodying the goddess, he was now accused of mocking God's design. The Church did not need to destroy the cults overnight. It only needed to make their worshippers doubt. Some resisted fiercely. There were festivals where Aphrodite's followers marched louder than ever, as if trying to drown out encroaching sermons with music. There were secret rites held deeper underground, where priestesses swore never to let the old ways die. Yet even they could feel the tide turning. For the first time, love itself felt dangerous. A glance carried guilt. An embrace carried fear. The body, once celebrated as a sacred instrument, became a liability, a fragile shell that might betray the soul. Christian writers composed treatises denouncing what they called pagan excess. They described the love cults not as spiritual traditions, but as brothels masquerading as sanctuaries. They wrote of Maenads not as liberated women, but as possessed madwomen. They mocked Aphrodite as a vain idol and painted Dionysus as a spirit of drunkenness rather than transformation. They used satire where sermon failed. They humiliated where they could not yet ban. And soon enough, mockery turned to law. As Christianity gained power within the Roman Empire, emperors began issuing decrees against sexual rites, gatherings of obscenity, and public displays of indecency. The language was vague by design. A dance could be labeled seduction. A kiss could be labeled perversion. A ritual bath could be labeled corruption. The same acts once seen as worship were now crimes. Priestesses of Aphrodite were stripped of their titles, declared harlots regardless of dignity. Sacred courtyards where lovers once left offerings were repurposed into monasteries. In some cities, statues of the goddess were defaced, her marble lips chipped away so that she could no longer smile upon passers-by. Dionysian groves were chopped down or consecrated as Christian chapels. And in public squares, bishops declared that love belonged to marriage alone, and even within marriage, it must never overpower restraint. The tragedy was not that desire vanished. Desire never vanishes. It simply went into hiding. What had once been sung now became whispered. What had once been celebrated now became confessed. And in that shift, in that slow, quiet suppression, something fundamental changed in the human spirit. Love was no longer a path to the divine. It was a test one had to survive without stumbling. But the Greeks had long believed that anything suppressed grows stronger in secret. And beneath the watchful eyes of priests and bishops, beneath the sermons and laws, beneath even the fear of hell, the old passions continued to flicker like embers beneath ash. For how could any decree erase what had once been worshipped? Despite the veneer of sanctity that surrounded these royal rites, those who participated in them were often left with lingering fear rather than spiritual enlightenment. Every movement was measured, every breath carefully taken, for a single misstep could be interpreted as an omen of cosmic displeasure. Servants walked backward in the presence of the queen, afraid to turn their backs, while priests spoke only in whispers, terrified that a wrongly uttered phrase could undo the protective charms placed around the chamber. Even the musicians who filled the silence with soft, trembling notes from harps and reed flutes, avoided looking directly at the queen's face, as if her eyes alone held the power to judge their souls. For the queen herself, the ritual was not merely a performance of devotion but a relentless examination of her worthiness. She was expected to appear untouched by fear, unmoved by pain, and impervious to exhaustion. Hours of standing motionless beneath burning incense left her vision blurred, yet she could not sway or stumble. The gold ornaments draped around her arms and neck were beautiful to behold, yet brutally heavy, biting into her flesh beneath the layers of fine linen. The attendants closest to her could see the sweat collecting beneath her collar, yet none dared to wipe it, for to touch her uninvited was forbidden. She had to endure every discomfort in silence, proving not just her divinity but her endurance. But what unsettled her more than physical strain was the weight of expectation. At certain points in the ceremony, she was commanded to recite sacred incantations believed to awaken hidden forces within her body. These words were said to bind her spirit to the realm of the gods, allowing energies far beyond human comprehension to flow through her veins. Some queens confessed, in private moments of weakness, that during these recitations they felt as though something ancient and watchful pressed against their soul, testing its strength. Whether this sensation was divine presence or the echo of fear, none could ever say. To fail in recitation would not only put her own life at risk, it was believed that the prosperity of the entire kingdom depended on her success. Even after the public portion of the ritual ended, the queen's ordeal did not. While others returned to their chambers, she was required to spend the night in solitude within a consecrated room, surrounded by symbols of rebirth and death. No human voice could speak to her until dawn. Some rooms were entirely dark, forcing her to sit among shadows and confront visions stirred by incense still burning in the air. Others were lit by a single oil lamp, flickering against walls painted with gods who watched without blinking. In that silence, every whisper of wind could sound like a spirit approaching. Some queens were said to emerge calm and radiant, claiming to have spoken with ancestors in dreams. Others came out pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what they had seen. The next morning, she was expected to smile before the court as though nothing had transpired. No weakness could be shown, no sign that fear had touched her. The people would cheer and kneel, believing they looked upon a living embodiment of celestial power. Yet beneath the jewels and ceremonial paint was a woman who had wrestled through a night not merely of devotion, but of survival. The night air was thick with incense and the heavy scent of wildflowers, carried down from the hills where the secret cults of love had taken root long before Rome or the Church had imposed their moral strictures. In the hidden sanctuaries and moonlit groves where these rituals thrived, the world seemed suspended between two realities: the mundane, where laws and duties weighed upon every step, and the sacred, where the body and spirit were free to intertwine in ways society had long forbidden. For those who entered, it was as though the ordinary laws of time and space dissolved, leaving only the primal pulse of existence, a heartbeat shared between gods and humans, between desire and devotion, between ecstasy and terror. Within the confines of a forest temple, draped in garlands of ivy and white lilies, a circle of initiates gathered, their faces shadowed beneath veils of sheer fabric. The air trembled with the low hum of chanting, each syllable vibrating through stone and soil alike. Candles flickered in uneven rhythm, casting shadows that danced across the carved idols of Aphrodite and Dionysus. These were not idol decorations but anchors, conduits of energy, each line and curve infused with the belief that the divine could be called down into the human body through careful ritual. Those who had come to the sanctuary knew that they were not merely observers. They were participants, instruments in a sacred symphony, their very presence necessary to complete the pattern the gods demanded. The ritual began with the softest touches, the brushing of hands along arms, the faint tracing of fingers along the contours of faces. Each contact was intentional, each gesture laden with meaning, echoing instructions passed down through generations of secret practitioners. These touches were not lustful in the ordinary sense, though desire was always present. They were affirmations of trust, of surrender, of communion with forces greater than themselves. The Maenads, the women of the Dionysian rites, moved in patterns that mimicked the spiraling ascent of vines and rivers, their feet tracing invisible symbols upon the earth. Those who followed them felt the floor beneath their feet pulse as if the soil itself were alive, responding to the collective rhythm of bodies united in devotion. Men, too, played their roles with exacting care. Some were warriors who had once sworn oaths of loyalty to city-states or kings, now repurposing that discipline in service to divine passion. Their strength was not measured in the weight of their swords but in the steadiness of their breathing, the firmness of their grip on the sacred staffs used to mark the boundaries of the circle. Each man knew that a misstep, a faltered movement, a hesitant glance, a thought that strayed from the sacred intent, could disrupt the flow of energy. The entire ritual depended on the equilibrium of its participants. And yet, equilibrium was never static. It was alive, fluctuating, demanding constant attention, constant surrender. The initiates were led through sequences of dance and chant designed to erode the barriers between self and other, between fear and desire. At first, the movements were small, tentative, measured. Hands lifted, arms stretched, heads tilted, feet tapping in quiet rhythm. But gradually, the pace increased, the music swelling into drumming so deep and resonant it felt as though it had originated not in human hands but in the earth itself. Breath came faster, hearts beat in unison, and the initiates began to lose awareness of themselves as separate entities. Every glance became a shared glance, every touch a shared sensation, every sigh an echo of collective longing. In those moments, pleasure and pain merged indistinguishably. Even exhaustion became a form of exaltation, a threshold that, once crossed, allowed the spirit to transcend the ordinary constraints of the body. One of the most feared and revered elements of the ceremony involved what the Greeks called the rite of inversion, a period in which social hierarchies were deliberately upended. Nobles knelt before servants, warriors deferred to women, priests allowed novices to guide them through sacred sequences. The act of reversal was not merely symbolic, it was believed to open a channel directly to divine understanding, to break the illusion of ego and reveal the eternal flow of existence beneath human distinctions. Yet for all its enlightenment, it carried profound psychological risk. Those unprepared could experience terror, disorientation, even temporary madness. Some fled into the night, never to return, leaving only whispers of their absence behind. Others emerged transformed, their eyes alight with clarity, their movements no longer constrained by hesitation or fear. Physical intimacy, when it occurred, was conducted with deliberate ritual precision. Unlike the carnal indulgence condemned by later authorities, it was framed as a sacred act, an offering of the self in service of the gods. Partners would pair not according to desire alone, but according to spiritual affinity and cosmic alignment. Touch was guided by chant, each motion timed to the cadence of drums, the intonation of hymns, the flickering shadows of the sanctuary. Lips met lips, hands traced arms and shoulders, but at every point there was conscious awareness, a mindfulness that elevated the act from mere pleasure to the level of sacrament. Every sigh, every tremor, every shiver was a prayer, a conversation between human and divine, a negotiation of energy that transcended morality as later defined by the Church. Yet ecstasy was never the sole purpose. Pain, too, played a role in the rites, subtle yet unavoidable. Participants endured hours on uneven stone floors, exposure to candle smoke that stung eyes and throat, the strain of holding difficult postures until the muscles screamed for release. These trials were not intended to punish but to purify, to burn away fear, shame, and pretense. Only when the body was fatigued, the mind stretched to its limits, and the ego loosened could the spirit truly commune with the divine. It was a philosophy that acknowledged the inseparability of pleasure and suffering, of beauty and terror, of creation and destruction. In those moments, participants often reported visions, lights that danced across the ceiling like living flames, whispers of voices not their own, fleeting glimpses of forms that seemed to hover between human and God. And then came the climax of the rite, when all boundaries dissolved entirely. The circle of initiates became a single organism, breathing, moving, and feeling as one. Music, chant, and motion converged into an almost unbearable intensity. Some described this experience as a form of death, not the cessation of life, but the death of the self, the ego, the fragile identity that separated them from the infinite. They would collapse, trembling, into the arms of companions, weeping with release, laughing with joy, sometimes screaming as the energy surged through their bodies in waves that seemed to lift them off the ground. In those sacred moments, morality, shame, and fear were suspended. Only the pulse of the universe, the interconnection of all things, remained. Even as these rites reached their apex, participants were acutely aware of the danger surrounding them. Stories abounded of priests discovered by Roman soldiers, of temples burned, of initiates dragged into dungeons for daring to seek divine communion. The Church would later label these rituals as heresy, as blasphemy, as devil worship. But within the sanctuaries, fear was not paralyzing. It heightened awareness, sharpened sensation, and intensified devotion. The knowledge that the world outside condemned what was occurring within added a charge, a kind of sacred electricity that made every touch, every movement, every chant feel simultaneously intimate and transgressive. After the climax, there was a slow descent, a ritualized return to ordinary consciousness. Participants lay upon the ground, arms entwined with companions, faces wet with sweat, tears, and the residue of incense. They whispered prayers of gratitude to the gods who had guided them, thanking them for the release, the vision, the communion. Some would sing softly to one another, recounting fragments of the experience, attempting to translate the inexpressible into language. Others remained silent, letting the aftershocks of sensation wash through them until body and spirit were once again aligned with the mortal plane. The rites were not only spiritual or sexual, they were political, psychological, and social acts. Bonds forged in the ritual often extended beyond the temple walls, forming networks of loyalty and intimacy that transcended class, gender, and city-state. Lovers, friends, and companions bound together in secret could influence decisions in public life, offering guidance, protection, or counsel that the uninitiated could never comprehend. In this way, the cults of love were not merely private indulgences, they were subversive forces, shaping the very fabric of Greek society from the shadows. Yet, as the Church's influence spread, these secret rites became increasingly dangerous. A participant caught in a grove or hidden sanctuary could face exile, imprisonment, or execution. Priests were vilified, priestesses demonized, and entire lineages of sacred knowledge were systematically erased. Despite the danger, the rites persisted, hidden deeper, whispered more quietly, and passed down from master to apprentice in secret. What the Church could not destroy, the initiates preserved in memory, in touch, in ritual, a hidden stream of human experience flowing beneath the sanctioned currents of history. By the end of each cycle of ritual, participants emerged irrevocably changed. They carried the memory of ecstasy and terror alike, an intimate knowledge of the self and the divine intertwined. Their souls were marked by experience, their bodies charged with energy that could not be spoken aloud. And in that transformation lay the essence of the cults themselves. Not mere indulgence, not mere rebellion, but a profound exploration of the boundaries of human consciousness, love, and devotion. A challenge to the world that would one day seek to suppress every whisper of passion, every trace of ecstatic surrender. Even centuries later, when temples lay in ruins, texts burned, and priests vanished into the shadows of history, the memory of these rites persisted. It lived in the hearts of those who dared to seek communion beyond the ordinary, who understood that love, desire, and devotion were not separate, but part of the same sacred fire. And it whispered to those willing to listen, reminding them that the human capacity for ecstasy, for transformation, and for communion with the divine could never be fully extinguished, no matter how many laws were written, how many temples destroyed, or how many voices silenced. The shadows of ancient Greece had always concealed a kind of beauty that most feared to name aloud, a beauty born of love untamed, of passion that refused to be confined by law or decorum. In the temples, in the groves, and in the secret chambers far from the city streets, worshippers of Aphrodite and Dionysus experienced the world in a way that defied ordinary understanding. They understood that pleasure could be holy, that touch could be transformative, that desire could open doors to the divine. But as Christianity spread across the Hellenic world, that same passion became the object of fear, suspicion, and eventual persecution. What had once been exalted was now condemned. What had been celebrated was now criminal. The air itself seemed to carry accusation, every glance and whisper a potential threat. By the time the Church had established firm authority in the Greek cities, the cults were forced to retreat further into darkness. Festivals that had once drawn thousands now occurred only in the dead of night, hidden behind curtains of ivy and stone, where only the initiated could enter. Lovers no longer met in public gardens, where music and laughter had filled the air. They now convened in basements and abandoned sanctuaries, their eyes darting to doors, their ears straining for the sound of approaching authority. The very acts that had once been expressions of faith were now dangerous. Each touch, each whispered vow, each stolen kiss became a rebellion against a world that no longer understood them. The Maenads of Dionysus, once famed for their ecstatic frenzies in the forest, were now hunted like prey. Their dances, meant to elevate the soul, were reinterpreted by authorities as signs of possession by devils. They were accused of madness, witchcraft, and subversion. Christian writers painted their rituals in the darkest of colors, tearing animals apart, shedding human blood, corrupting innocence. The reality was far more subtle, far more tragic. The women had not sought to harm, they had sought transcendence, to dissolve the barriers between self and divine. Yet perception had turned their liberation into sin, their devotion into crime. For the priests of Aphrodite, survival required cunning. They taught their followers to speak in coded language, to perform rituals in forms that would seem innocuous to outsiders. Hymns of love became veiled poetry, whose words concealed sacred meanings only understood by those initiated into the mysteries. Ceremonies that had once been extravagant displays of devotion, garlands, incense, music, and wine, were pared down to the barest essentials, conducted in secret, whispered into the night. The sensuality that had been central to their faith was forced into metaphor and symbol, its physicality replaced with mental discipline and secrecy. But the longing remained, insistent and unyielding. Desire does not vanish under threat, it hides, plotting its resurgence in the shadows. Perhaps the most tragic were the young initiates, who had been raised to see the body as divine, to understand that love could be a sacred conduit. They came of age in secret, learning rites that had been passed down for generations, only to discover that what they had been taught to cherish was now condemned. The initiation into mystery, once a moment of joy and revelation, became a test of courage and endurance. They were forced to navigate a treacherous world in which a single indiscretion could bring punishment or death. The very act of remembering their traditions could be interpreted as heresy. And yet, in quiet corners of abandoned temples, in silent whispers behind closed doors, they practiced. They whispered prayers to gods who no longer had altars, touched each other in ways that were sacred only to them, and reminded themselves that their devotion was not shameful, that it was merely forbidden. As the church consolidated power, the consequences became more severe. Temples were demolished, statues defaced, sacred texts burned. Priests and priestesses who refused to renounce their faith were arrested, interrogated, and sometimes executed. Even the most discreet gatherings were subject to surveillance. Informants were common, neighbors reported strange activity to the authorities, and entire communities could be punished for tolerating the old ways. Love became a crime. Desire became evidence of rebellion. Passion became a weapon against the state itself. The psychological toll was enormous. Fear became constant, and the participants learned to mask every natural impulse with careful control. Every glance, every touch, every movement was weighed against the possibility of discovery. Yet even amid this terror, something remarkable occurred. The cults adapted, transformed, and endured. Their rituals became coded, not because the desire diminished, but because survival demanded cleverness. Love became secret scripture. Touch became sacred cipher. A glance could convey messages that words could not. They wrote symbols into the corners of walls, leaving traces of devotion for those who could decipher them. In this way, the spirit of the cults persisted, even when the flesh was constrained. What the church could not destroy was not the rituals themselves, but the memory of them, the understanding that love, when unfettered, could transcend fear. The tension between beauty and cruelty, between ecstasy and suppression, created a heightened psychological landscape. Participants became masters of control and secrecy, yet every act of obedience to the church's mandates was accompanied by private mourning for the loss of freedom. Some developed complex forms of emotional layering, public compliance masking private rebellion, outward submission paired with inward exaltation. Others found solace in shared suffering. Lovers clung to one another not just for passion, but for courage, knowing that in each other's arms they could experience a fragment of the sacred intimacy that had been stolen from the world. Every stolen touch, every secret kiss, every hidden ceremony became magnified in meaning, a defiance against a universe that had recast love as sin. Perhaps most hauntingly, the participants internalized the very surveillance that threatened them. Eyes were everywhere, real or imagined, and a sense of omnipresent judgment seeped into their minds. Each glance in a mirror, each private thought, was scrutinized against invisible standards. The psychological impact was profound, heightened anxiety, oscillating between exhilaration and terror, intimacy and paranoia, devotion and dread. Love became a site of both salvation and torment. And yet the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. Even in hiding, even under persecution, the sacred fires of desire and devotion continued to burn, flickering, shaping every decision, every memory, every dream. Over time, these secret practices began to shape the early cultural memory of Greece itself. Folklore preserved fragments of rites, songs retained veiled references to gods, and myths endured in forms adapted to Christian morality. The cults became part of an underground heritage, a hidden lineage that connected generations of worshippers in whispered continuity. They were no longer dominant, no longer public, but they were immortal in memory, and immortal in the hearts of those who dared to love freely. In this hidden world, the contrasts were extreme. Pleasure and terror coexisted, ecstasy and fear were inseparable, devotion and survival were fused into a single, unyielding discipline. The human body, once celebrated as sacred instrument, was constantly at risk, a site of both holy expression and mortal vulnerability. The soul, once unbound by law, was now measured against the weight of omnipresent authority. And yet, paradoxically, this very oppression intensified the meaning of every act of love. To hold another's hand in secret was no longer merely touching flesh. It was a ritual of defiance, a sacrament of rebellion, a statement that desire and devotion could survive even in the harshest shadow. And so, through fear, repression, and cruelty, the forbidden love cults endured, not openly, not proudly, but persistently. They became the hidden backbone of an ancient wisdom the Church sought to erase, the memory of a world in which love was not sin, in which the body was holy, in which passion was a path to divinity. Every secret hymn sung in darkness, every touch hidden behind closed doors, every coded gesture of devotion was a quiet affirmation. The gods had not abandoned them. The human heart had not surrendered. And even in the face of condemnation, beauty, desire, and devotion persisted, undiminished, waiting for the day when the memory of forbidden love could once again emerge into the light. The centuries that followed would attempt to erase every trace of the forbidden love cults of ancient Greece, but erasure is never truly complete. Stones can be shattered, temples burned, and scrolls reduced to ash, yet human memory, imagination, and desire have a way of preserving what the world seeks to destroy. For every priestess condemned, there remained the memory of her voice singing in hidden chambers. For every queen isolated by ritual, there remained the echo of her steps across moonlit courtyards. Even as Christianity spread, bringing with it new doctrines of purity, sin, and restraint, the ghosts of those earlier worlds lingered in whispers, in art, in the secret corners of the cities where forbidden passion had once thrived. These ghosts were not malevolent, nor were they merely sentimental echoes. They were witnesses to a truth too dangerous to be fully acknowledged, a truth about what it means to desire, to surrender, and to become more than one's body or society might allow. The Church, in its steady march of moral codification, sought to reframe every act of love as potential sin. Every Maenad, every sacred courtesan, every gender-defying priest became a cautionary tale. Tales of excess were exaggerated into legends of depravity. Hymns of longing became sermons about lust. And yet, these narratives, written by those who feared the freedom of the human heart, inadvertently preserved the memory of a world that once defied the ordinary, that celebrated transformation, and that recognized desire as a form of communion with the divine. Where the Church saw heresy, the people who remembered these stories glimpsed a kind of forbidden wisdom, that ecstasy, pain, and love were inseparable from the spiritual, that the boundary between the mortal and the immortal was not law, but a threshold to be crossed with courage and care. Even in the ashes of temples, traces persisted. Votive offerings buried beneath rubble hinted at rituals performed in secrecy, offerings that were neither political nor transactional, but deeply personal. Inscriptions, barely legible from centuries of decay, spoke of love, longing, and devotion that could not survive in daylight. Archaeologists who later uncovered these fragments often sensed the vibrancy behind them, a pulse of humanity that refused to die. The courtyards, the chambers, and the grottos had long since been repurposed or forgotten, yet in those stones lingered an invisible tapestry of intimacy, desire, and sacred practice. Each piece of pottery, each carved symbol, each faded mural spoke of a humanity that loved fiercely, sometimes dangerously, but always completely. And in private lives, even as public expression was suppressed, the memory of these practices persisted, passed down through families, whispered between lovers, coded into art, music, and clandestine gatherings. Lovers learned to recognize the patterns of ritual in the way hands touched, the way eyes met, the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. The sacred knowledge, once codified in temple rites, became instinctual, embedded in human behavior in ways the church could not legislate. Desire became subtle, careful, and yet no less potent. Where the ancients had danced openly beneath the moon, their descendants now moved in shadows, inventing secret languages of touch and glance, perpetuating a forbidden philosophy that the body itself was capable of wisdom, transformation, and transcendence. Some of the most haunting legacies were psychological. The human mind, confronted with both ecstatic love and severe restriction, learns both fear and wonder in equal measure. The queens and priestesses of old had walked the line between devotion and destruction, pleasure and duty, joy and isolation. They had been vessels for divine power and witnesses to mortal fragility, aware that one wrong word, one missed gesture, could invoke consequences far beyond their own comprehension. That psychological tension, the constant balancing of self against expectation, desire against fear, did not vanish with the destruction of temples or the burning of texts. It seeped into culture, into art, into literature, and into the deepest recesses of human thought. It became the lens through which later generations understood passion, power, and morality. This tension also exposed the paradox of human civilization. Humanity has always sought order, laws, and morality, yet it is the chaotic, uncontrolled impulses that often generate the most profound beauty. The cults of Aphrodite, Dionysus, and their lesser-known counterparts revealed that moral rigidity, while comforting to society, often suppresses transformative experience. The Greeks themselves understood this, which is why their myths so often celebrate the tension between chaos and order, reason and desire, life and death. The Church, by contrast, codified a fear of desire, creating frameworks that punished the very impulses the ancients considered sacred. But history has shown that such impulses do not disappear. They are merely redirected, hidden, and reinterpreted. Even today, in the shadows of modernity, one can trace echoes of these forbidden traditions. Literature celebrates illicit passion, art celebrates bodies intertwined in reverence or rebellion, and even theater often stages rituals that mirror those long-lost ceremonies. The fascination is not merely voyeuristic. It is archetypal. Humans continue to grapple with the tension between love as sanctity and love as transgression. We are drawn to stories of what society condemned because, at some level, we understand that these acts explore dimensions of humanity that regulation and fear cannot fully contain. The Greeks understood that desire was both dangerous and divine, both illuminating and corrupting. The Church feared this knowledge because it threatened control over the human spirit. Yet the power of these rituals endures in the collective unconscious, reminding us that love, in its most liberated form, is transformative, terrifying, and eternal. And so, as the centuries stretch and civilizations rise and fall, the forbidden love cults of ancient Greece remain a haunting mirror to the present. They remind us that morality is often a lens applied after the fact, that desire and devotion can be sacred even when society cannot understand them, and that beauty and danger are frequently inseparable. They force us to confront questions that remain uncomfortable to this day. Can love exist without restraint? Can desire be a form of knowledge? Can the human spirit be both fragile and infinite, bound by rules yet capable of transcendence? These questions have no simple answers. But in the shadows of forgotten temples, in the whispers of long-suppressed rituals, in the echoes of human experience, one can still hear the answer, that to love fully is to risk everything, yet in that risk lies the path to something greater than life itself. The legacy of these cults is, ultimately, a warning and a gift. It warns of the fragility of freedom in the face of authority. It warns of the dangers that accompany unchecked power, whether wielded by kings, priests, or gods themselves. And it gifts us with the memory of a time when human beings dared to touch the divine through desire, when they accepted ecstasy as a tool of transformation, and when they lived at the threshold between mortal fear and sacred transcendence. Those who hear these stories today are asked not merely to marvel at the past, but to reflect on the human condition, to understand that what is forbidden is often the most illuminating, and that what is suppressed is rarely extinguished. We are left, finally, with the haunting knowledge that the story of these cults is not entirely behind us. In every act of forbidden love, in every ritual of devotion that defies expectation, in every moment when humans surrender to forces larger than themselves, the ghosts of the Greeks' sacred rites stir once more. They remind us that history is not only what is written in stone, but what is etched into the human heart. Desire, devotion, and the pursuit of the divine through the body, all continue quietly, insistently, eternally. And perhaps, in that persistence, lies the truest lesson of all, that to live fully is to walk the line between what is permitted and what is profound, between fear and ecstasy, between mortality and the eternal.